Hello, ladies and gentlemen. You are listening to the Historia podcast. I'm your host, the Inquisitive Historian, and you are in welcome to episode 10 of the Inquisitive... I'm getting my names mixed up. Welcome to episode 10 of the Historia podcast. There we go. Now, this episode's going to be interesting because it's episode 10, but it is the first episode that I am actually recording live with the intention of it being a Historia podcast episode. Because the first few episodes have been me reading essays I wrote a long time ago, or re-editing streams and videos I've done a long time ago. This episode, starting with episode 10, is a proper Historia podcast episode, sort of what I envision for the series. And, so I'm going to be rusty. This podcast has not had a strong start. We didn't start with like 5 good episodes. We started with 5 episodes where I was reading an essay I wrote a long time ago. So this is me testing out the format of actually... Because I'm always studying history, and I'm always taking notes, and often once I've consumed those notes, I just delete the notes and move on, which usually ends up in me forgetting what I've learned, and the Historia podcast gives me an outlet to sort of regurgitate my notes, and sort of ponder about the stuff I've learned, and it gives me a podcast to look back and listen to. So... No, I could always just save my notes, but I tend to write my notes in a very scatterbrained fashion, so even if I save my notes, if I go back and look at my notes, I'm not going to understand what I'm saying, so this podcast gives me the opportunity to reword things. They say that to truly know something, you need to be able to teach it, and this is sort of me being able to teach myself the history I've already learned, that I can go back and look at. Now, unfortunately, as the first proper episode of the Historia podcast, and I'm still getting used to this format, I have not made it easy for myself, considering the topic I want to talk about today. Because the topic... is a bit complicated and a bit controversial. Wrongly, I think. I don't think it should be this controversial. But it also enters into the world of science rather than just history. I have a very broad definition of history. I believe history began with the beginning. I believe history began at what is currently estimated to be around 13.8 billion years ago with the Big Bang. And I believe history ends 1 second ago. And I don't mean 1 second ago from when I said 1 second ago. I mean history ends perpetually in a state of 1 second ago. So, my definition of history is a very broad definition of history. But I'm interested in history because I like learning about the past. And I don't believe the past I don't believe that there should be an arbitrary line between what is history and what should fall under any other category. So I think a lot of archaeology, a lot of paleontology that's history, it's... And real history has elements of that science stuff, too. So science and history are linked. Not only science and history, but also journalism and news reporting are all linked in this great mass of stuff of the past that I call history. So expect me to, every now and then, go back really far. Like, okay, this isn't typically considered under the sphere of history. We're going really far back here, Inquisitive Historian, but I really like history, and I define history as anything that happened before now, with now being the current moment whenever you say that statement. So I don't know. I didn't make this easy for me. I didn't pick a topic. I wasn't studying a topic that was easy. I didn't do a simple war, or a simple movement, or a simple act of legislation, or a funny incident in the past. I went real far back, just because this was what has been interesting to me lately. And, I study history all over time and space. And I just so happened to be on this very complicated topic for this podcast. Let me walk through traditionally accepted history. The history that's taught in academia. The history that's supported by the establishment of academia. So, around 13.8 billion years ago, you have your Big Bang. Around just over 4 billion years ago, Earth forms. Somewhere around the 3 billion year old mark, life begins. Somehow, a living cell starts in a primordial soup of chemicals that, might I add, has never been repeated. It has never been replicated. That theoretical process that the first cell, the first form of life, maybe not even a cell but a proto-cell, came out of the very strange mix of chemicals. They call it abiogenesis. And abiogenesis is sort of formed from the conclusion of, we know that it was a weird chemical mix going on Earth at the time. And, things tend to happen weirdly when you have all these weird chemicals. And so the theory goes that the first proto-cell, the first thing you could call life, began somewhere in that strange carbon soup, which again has never been replicated. So we're still waiting for more knowledge on that. As time goes on, you get the oceans, you eventually get crust, you have plate tectonics moving things around. Life eventually will become plants that will eventually lead to the spread of oxygen. There's a time period where oxygen is really intense, and some creatures that come to the land begin to be a bit more larger. This is the age of the great bugs and all that. The fish walk on land after their food moves to the land due to the grass and plants, and eventually that grows into reptiles, and eventually mammals, and eventually you have these small little almost squirrel-like creatures running around, while the reptiles have grown to be these massive creatures that dominate the earth, known as the dinosaurs. Then, around 65 million years ago, something happens. Something happens that leads to a great extinction event at the end of the Cretaceous period. An event that we typically assume to be an asteroid. However, there's a lot of kickback against the asteroid theory. Some say it was climate change. Some say it was a volcanic eruption that blotted out the sun, which could be replicated with an asteroid strike as well, to kick up everything that's needed to blot out the sun. And it leads to a mass extinction of the large animals in the world, the dinosaurs primarily. But there's some kickback against that. There's some kickback against the idea that an asteroid came down and wiped out the dinosaurs. And the reason there's a kickback is because the idea that an asteroid can come down and wipe out civilization is a little bit of catastrophism. The idea that catastrophes have helped shape the history of the Earth. And there's a movement established in academia that is hesitant to accept a catastrophic idea of history. They support a more uniformitarian, I'm not sure if I got that word right, but a uniformity to history, that what we observe in the modern day is how things were in the past. And because we don't see asteroids coming down that frequently and wiping us out in the modern day, then how likely is it really that that happened in the past? And there's a reason this anti-catastrophic idea exists, and it has to deal with the origin of science. The very earliest origins of science were sort of built alongside religion. Around the time, there was the saying, the idea that science wasn't meant to refute the gods. It was meant to help understand the world the gods created. And around the time of the Enlightenment in Europe in the 1700s, you sort of get this, it's part of this tradition of this sort of kickback against religion, in Europe at least. Europe, which has maintained a large tradition and establishment within global academia at this point in time. But the Enlightenment kind of pushes back against the idea of biblical literalism, stuff like that, and especially with the 1800s popping up and new discoveries being made by Charles Darwin, people are starting to question the literalist interpretation of the Bible. And at some point, scientists are like, yeah, the Bible is myth, it cannot be taken seriously. Which is understandable why they would think that, but it led to this uniform ideology and a rejection of catastrophism, because catastrophism, I'm not entirely sure of the argument here, but catastrophism is viewed as something that flies too close to the sun of potential religious connotations. But that's pretty much why the 65 million year asteroid hypothesis isn't why it has so much of a kickback to it. Because if an asteroid hit 65 million years ago, that means an asteroid could have hit later. And we'll get to that. But and by the way, there's the crater off the coast of the Yucatan Peninsula. That is very likely the impact of where the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs and launched the Cretaceous extinction event took place. But moving on the timeline of what is currently traditionally accepted history, the dinosaurs go extinct, the little squirrel things manage to live, small mammals continue to survive because they don't need that much energy, and their diets aren't necessarily that impacted. They have to make some adaptations, of course, but they still survive, and they continue to evolve, and they continue to evolve, and then eventually these rodents grow into things that are more like lemurs, that grow into things that, and of course these aren't literally anatomically identical to the lemurs and other analogous species of today, but eventually they evolve into things that look a bit more like primates. And then eventually we get to Australopithecus, which is an ape that begins to slowly turn into things like Homo erectus. And then we get a chain of evolution, not necessarily a back-to-back evolution. There are branches here and there. For example, the Neanderthals eventually pop up, but the Neanderthals are not, evolutionarily speaking, the ancestors of Homo Sapiens that pop up. They're more like evolutionary siblings coming out of Homo habilis or Homo heidelbergensis. It really depends on which. There's a very thin line between Homo habilis, Homo heidelbergensis, and Homo erectus, but somewhere along the line, Neanderthals and Homo sapiens pop up. But Homo sapiens pop up around 200,000 years ago in Africa. Around 100,000 years ago, they begin to leave Africa, and there are signs that they might have been in Arabia, temporarily speaking, in the grand scheme of things before 100,000 years ago. But by 100,000 years ago, there's this great migration that spreads across the world. Ultimately, 13,000 years ago was when they crossed the land bridge of Beringia into North America. And then our own there were several ice ages in the history of Earth, but there was something called the Younger Dryas that starts around... Where is it? Where's my notes? That's not my notes. Here we go. Where are my notes? This is... Okay. Something called the Younger Dryas happens around 12,800 years ago to 11,700 years ago, and it's a very quick environmental change. Suddenly, things get a bit colder and a bit wetter. And it leads to this major event that changes everything. But then, after the Ice Age, and this Younger Dryas sort of is the end of the Ice Age. The Ice Age actually begins around, 115,000 years ago? Somewhere around that ballpark. And then it ends with the Younger Dryas, which it's hard to tell, but there is a massive climactic change, and then things went back to normal before things went to a more warmer time period. In fact, I believe a little bit warmer than it is today. But then humanity continues to grow after the Younger Dryas, and then around 10,000 years ago, we invent agriculture. Around 10,000 years ago, we noticed that the seeds, and we were hunter-gatherers this entire time, since our appearance 200,000 years ago, and we were hunter-gatherers, and eventually we noticed that these fruits we're eating have seeds that grow. And then we start making agriculture around Mesopotamia, and then you have the agricultural revolution, which leads to civilization. That's the mainline traditional history. And around the agricultural revolution, or the Neolithic revolution, is when you kind of get the road to modern history. It's when we end sort of the Stone Age era and begin the Bronze Age, and into the Iron Age. And that's sort of when prehistory begins, with the Stone Age sort of being its own level of deep history. Now, there are some weird things about that. There are some things that... I don't know what order I want to cover this stuff I want to cover. I don't know what order I should cover it. The Younger Dryas remains a big question mark in the history of humanity. And... I really don't know what order I want to talk about things. There's a suggestion that the Younger Dryas might not have been that big of a deal. I guess we can start with the Greenland Ice Cores. Now, this is where we start to build the foundation that the traditional theory of what happened might need some tweaking. The Greenland Ice Cores were around, I think, a 2-mile? It might have been longer. A 2-mile section of an ice core dug from Greenland. And you can tell by... I don't know the exact science behind the Greenland ice cores, but the ice cores sort of hint at the global population, or not, the regional population, I should say, a regional population over the course of history. And the Greenland ice core, the ice up in Greenland is some of the most ancient ice on all of the planet. So you get a really good time capsule of the climate around the Greenland region at that time. And what you get is you see the alteration, the fluctuation, I should say, of the global or not necessarily the global, but typically since that's the ice cap, it's usually a hint at what's going on globally, of the environment shifting, the climate fluctuating. Since way, way, way before humanity, the climate keeps shifting. And then, around 12,800 years ago, there's a boom, a big climate shift. And then there's another boom, 11,700 years ago. And then after that, things start to stabilize. Things are still colder than they are today. There's a gradual warming, but there were periods in human history that were warmer. And then we start to get to the reason why some of this stuff is debated, because the Greenland Ice Cores do not follow the proposed computer hypothesis that is used as the foundation for the current global warming model. The ice cores don't contradict that the Earth is warming. They don't contradict that the Industrial Revolution and humans are a contributing cause to the global warming. But it does hold that we've survived hotter times and that the Earth is constantly fluctuating. And that the models used to predict global warming are based off of recorded temperatures that are only a really, really small segment of human history. A small part of global history, but also a small section of human history. And we can see similar phases throughout the lifespan of humans where things are sort of similar, if not worse. But then the climate always goes back down. It's always fluctuating. So the fact that the very foundation of what we're going to be talking about kind of contradicts global warming models leads to some... what's the word? Not... the word clashback is in my mind, and I know that's not a word. Pushback. Let's say pushback. There we go. The idea is, in that quick amount of time, the idea is that an asteroid hit. And maybe not just an asteroid or a comet, sometimes it's hypothesized, but maybe several hit. Here's the deal. Around 20,000 years ago, a comet or an asteroid, whatever, entered the solar system and arrived somewhere along the line in the path of Earth orbit, where it broke apart and essentially became a large asteroid field right in the path of Earth orbit. A field that we cross through as a planet, we cross through twice. Once in around June, July, and another time near the end of October, the beginning of November. It's around that time where the odds of us getting hit by a large-scale asteroid increases dramatically. I believe that there was an incident in the 2010s where there was an asteroid over Russia, or a comet over Russia, that blew up and had, I think, over 1,000 injuries. And I think that happened during that time frame. There was also the Tunguska Incident? Or the Tunguska Incident? I don't like Googling things during podcasts. The Tunguska event, which happened in June. That was essentially like a comet or an asteroid explodes over Russia. That was like multiple atomic bombs or something like that. It was incredible. And what's funny is, for example, if the asteroid over Russia in the 2010s was any bigger, like the rocks that are out there in the asteroid field we cross through twice a year, that could have led to a lot of deaths. But many scientists don't want to take the threat of an asteroid that seriously because, again, it's a catastrophist idea. So there isn't much research being done into defense against asteroids. NASA says, yeah, there are these few thousand bodies that are close to us, but they will never hit us. Except whenever something comes close, whenever they say, oh, an asteroid's going to just graze by us, usually that's an object that they didn't find until like 10 days before. before it's forecasted to fly by. It's not taken that seriously, because ultimately, the idea that an asteroid can cause catastrophic damage doesn't fit the establishment of science. Or the scientific establishment, I should say. Now, where was I? How did I get on this? An asteroid. It is theorized, and this is called the Younger Dryas impact theory, and it's proposed by catastrophists, and there's pushback against it by the scientific establishment because it doesn't meet their idea of science. It doesn't help that the main leading figure of the Younger Dryas impact theory is a man by the name of Graham Hancock, and he can sometimes enter weird territory. He's released a lot, and he's a reporter, not necessarily a scientist, but he's found incredible amounts of evidence to support the impact theory, and at this point in time he's convinced of the impact theory, and he's more interested in the implications of the impact theory. And once you get to the implications, it's really, besides a few points that we will get into, it's purely speculation and sort of shaped by his own worldview, and that makes it easier to dismiss him. But even he builds his own theories on people that have provided a lot of information to the base of his theories, even if he doesn't believe in 100% of the people he's basing his research on. So, we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater here when it comes to Graham Hancock. The idea is a large asteroid hit Greenland, causing the Younger Dryas impact, or causing the Younger Dryas. The theory is an asteroid or comet, or asteroids or comets, or fragments of a larger comet, possibly at some point going through the asteroid field that was created 20,000 years ago, struck the Earth, struck Greenland, and that sort of asteroid falling, at this point in time, Earth is in the Ice Age. There is a huge ice cap, a glacier cap, that conquers Europe and Canada at this point in time. When that thing hits, that would vaporize the northern ice cap. It's not just that the glaciers are melting or retracting. They would be vaporized. It would not only would it vaporize the ice caps, unleashing massive tidal waves, it would have sent a lot of stuff up into the atmosphere, a lot of ice into the atmosphere, and possibly even, with the impact, some soot that could simultaneously cause mass fire catastrophes, but also mass rain. And going back to the vaporization of the ice caps, the sudden, very potentially in a 24-hour period, vaporizing of the ice caps, that would think about the tsunamis that hit Japan in 2011, that reached a bit inland and were around 30 to 50 feet tall. The sudden vaporization of the ice caps would result in around 1,000-foot tall tsunamis bursting through, like, Montana and Wyoming in the United States, that deep inland from the north, from the ice caps that pretty much covered Canada. into Washington, it would very well look like a global flood. A very quick and very destructive global flood that would have places like the southern hemisphere, especially places like Australia, probably wouldn't have seen tsunamis, but it would also have gotten mass flooding. This would have been a drastic event that happened around 12,800 to 11,700 years ago. And it would have been greatly traumatic to the humans that were alive during this time. And the impact of the Younger Dryas impact theory and the idea that this massive flood happened, this great cataclysm that would have destroyed everything, and indeed, the sea level rises incredibly at this time period. It would have been traumatic for humanity. There's also this theory, this asteroid impact theory, coincides with this extinction. It's an extinction level event for a lot of the megafauna, a lot of the big animals in North America particularly, and I think also in Europe. And maybe Australia? I can't remember in Australia. Something else happened in Australia. But Australia is kind of an outlier in this regard, although it does seem South Africa was impacted. And we'll get to that later. We'll get to the proof of the Great Cataclysm later. But where do I even want to go? There's the extinction of the animals. In traditional history, the traditionally scientific belief is that all the big animals in North America, and I think South America too, were wiped out in like a period of 100 years by the arrival of humans, crossing the land bridge around 13,000 years ago. The hunter-gatherers arrived in what is called the overkill hypothesis, or the blitzkrieg, of hunter-gatherers showing up and just blitzing North and South America, killing all the great megafauna in an unbelievable amount of time. The thing is, that doesn't follow with the patterns of hunter-gatherers. Hunter-gatherers, it wouldn't make sense for them to blitz the woolly mammoths immediately. It just wouldn't make sense. It doesn't add up, the overkill hypothesis. It doesn't match hunter-gatherer activity today. And it's this weird idea that humans arrived and just suddenly were like, let's kill everything. And really it seems to come from the same philosophical viewpoint that you see in science, that humans are a bad thing, that you can't deny exist in a lot of scientific ideas, that humans are just this destructive force that exists to bring about entropy. A very nihilistic viewpoint, a very post-Enlightenment type viewpoint. It doesn't follow. It just doesn't follow. The overkill hypothesis, I don't think, is valid. Maybe there were significant hunting that took place during the Great Cataclysm, because at this point, it's a tragedy. Humans, I would say, would be sent to the Dark Ages, except the traditionally held belief that there wasn't civilization before this, which we'll get into. But humans would be in a very desperate point in their lives, so maybe there would be a lot of hunting, but it wouldn't explain the mass death we see in North America that coincide with the Younger Dryas. I don't know where to go next. some of this stuff has to be fed piece by piece, because if you lay it all out at once in the wrong order, people start to go, oh, I don't know about this, because it's a fantastic incident. Let's see. Okay, how about we talk about evidence for the impact? The Younger Dryas impact theory was dismissed for a long time because, well, there's no impact crater in Greenland. I think in around 2019, we found a large impact crater in Greenland. We haven't dated it yet because it's under miles and miles of ice, but it's big. And it's estimated to be that big and have that little evidence of erosion on the crater itself. It's theorized to be about 12,000 years ago. Hasn't been dated yet, but, you know. Oh, here's another note. At this point in time, North America would have been dominated by what we call the Clovis culture today. With this great cataclysm, Clovis culture pretty much disappears. They're replaced by a new culture that comes out of their ashes. But their quarries are suddenly abandoned. You find campsites with toolkits and debris left over. There's much evidence that the human population crashed with the great cataclysm. And another point that supports the great cataclysm is this layer. This black matte layer. There's this layer not found unilaterally, but is found across the world of, what are they? Of platinum, of high temperature spherules, melt glass, and nanodiamonds across 50 million kilometers on the Earth's surface. A lot of that stuff either comes from meteorites or from the effects of either a meteorite impact or I should say a celestial body impact, you know, an asteroid, a comet, whatever, or a nuclear explosion. And it's found at the layer, and it's a very small layer, but it's found at the layer of around 12,000 years ago. I think there's enough evidence that yes, some sort of impact happened around 12,000 years ago, vaporized the ice cap and the glaciers, led to a vast amounts of tsunamis and global raining. It was a catastrophe. It really was a great cataclysm. It was an extinction event for much of the creatures we see at this time. Not all, but a lot. Some people say, well, there were mammoths in northern Siberia that survived. But you have to keep in mind that there were a lot of creatures that survived the 65 million years ago impact that survived a little bit later. There were some fragments that survived a little bit later than they should have. Those woolly mammoths that survived up in Siberia aren't necessarily an outlier. Well, they're an outlier, but they're not disproof. They're not debunking the Great Cataclysm. Let's see. We see the evidence of the impact. We see the crater. We see the meteorite fragments. Human civilization, if you can call it civilization at this point in time, they would have gone through an incident where they saw many people die, maybe even into the thousands, and only small bands of survivors were able to make it. Some might even believe they could have been the only remaining survivors on Earth after what essentially would have been a great flood across the planet. Now, what's interesting is, after the flood, after the Great Cataclysm, From around 9,000 years ago to 6,000 years ago, the Earth stabilizes. It enters what's called the climactic optimum, and it's warmer than today. Historically, periods of warming are generally associated with periods of growth, as opposed to periods of cold. Periods of warming mean you can farm more, you can expand more, there's more land you can get into. So there was the climactic optimum that almost immediately followed the Great Cataclysm. It's like nature did this huge destructive event, and then all of a sudden the Earth became much more nurturing, much more peaceful. And it's in this 9,000 to 6,000 year ago range where we get the traditionally accepted date for the agricultural revolution. This is when we start growing farms. It supports longer growing seasons. People spread out from the land that's now available after the end of the Ice Age. It's sort of described, this climactic optimum is described as this sort of paradise, this quasi-paradise realm. A much more peaceful time, very little evidence of warfare. When it comes to evidence of warfare, I believe some of our earliest records are around 12,000 years ago. The earliest records seem to start with the Great Cataclysm, where you would have everything break down and everyone's trying to survive. You have bands of survivors. It was a post-apocalyptic world, and some of our earliest signs of warfare come from that time period, come from the Great Cataclysm. And then we get the climactic optimum, and all of a sudden warfare seems to have stopped. Really, the only records we see is that sometimes some people are hunting the same animal, and they say, hey, this is my animal, and then they shoot at them with their hunting arrows. But there are no stockades, there are no offensive weaponry that aren't meant for anything more than hunting. There's no art depicting war. Any conflict that happens seems to be very simple and very limited. Interestingly enough, when the climactic optimum, when this paradise era ends around 6,000 years ago, we get this Neo-Glacian era where the planet begins to cool again, and all of a sudden a lot of the farms can't grow. We've spread further out across the Earth, but we are no longer have the resources to support ourselves going this far across the Earth. Then you start seeing more fighting, more wars, more battlefields from this time period 6,000 years ago. So this climactic optimum, right after this dramatic Great Cataclysm, is so much more peaceful. It's like this apocalypse, and then there was the post-apocalyptic fighting for survival, but then the planet cools down in the sense of it's no longer chaotic. Actually warmer than it was today, and things become peaceful, which is very interesting. Let's see. I've covered the climactic optimum. I have covered the Clovis culture and how this was definitely an apocalypse. I've pretty much laid out the evidence that there was the meteorites and there was the Great Cataclysm. Human population crashed. We've talked about the asteroid field. The sea levels did rise significantly. Okay. We've talked about the platinum and the end of the Clovis culture. So, I am a firm believer that something like the Great Cataclysm did happen. There was this epic flood that covered the Earth. But what do we do with this? If we take the assumption that the Great Cataclysm took place, a great flood took place, what does that leave us with when we have all these cultural traditions that talk about a flood that are worldwide? And really, and to be clear, there is Scientists don't debate that there was a huge, massive flood around Washington, Montana, around that area. A massive flood that happened when humans were alive. What they debate, however, is they say that it was this massive ice river dam type thing up north in Canada that thawed out with the warming of the earth and led to this massive flood. They disagree, the traditionalists disagree that it was part of one big flood. But there are these traditions and these legends of great floods throughout the world. And they all kind of say the same thing. The gods are no longer happy with you. The gods or God are no longer happy with life on Earth. Whether they be heathens, whether they've forgotten to worship, whether they've become too full of themselves. In many cultures, what happens next is something comes from the sky. You have the Greek. I believe it's Greek. It might not be Greek. It might be something else. Maybe prior to Greek. But there's this legend of this child who was born to the son of the sun god, who controlled the sun with a chariot. And one day, he doesn't know his father, but they are told, I forget the legend exactly, but essentially he learns that his father is the god of the sun, and Helios, I believe, and is determined to find him. And he eventually finds Helios, the god of the sun, his father, and Helios is like, I'm so glad to have met you. I'm so glad we were reunited. I'm sorry I was absent for so long. I'll give you a gift. What do you want? And his son says, I want to control the chariot that controls the sun. And Helios is like, oh, I'm not so sure about that, because you need a little bit of skill to control the sun, to control this chariot. But eventually the sun forces Helios to let him take the reins, and he does. And the sun goes crazy, eventually starts hurling itself through Earth, or to Earth. The gods manage to stop it just in time, but it sends the sun, S-O-N, flying off into space, into the heavens, presumably to die. And then his sisters cry, and their tears rain down upon the earth. This Greek tradition of something fiery from the sky coming down towards Earth, and then after that, a lot of flooding. Sumerian culture depicts the gods throwing down something on Earth, and then the flood begins. And then Sumerian culture begins to talk about how the gods were traumatized by this flood and decided to abandon Earth. And maybe some came after the flood, but I'm not sure. I haven't done enough research into that. What do we do with all this cultural evidence that suggests that there is something similar to this? Here's another thing I want to talk about. Homo sapiens came about around 200,000 years ago. And I think there's this natural prejudice we have when we look into the past. Even if we know it's not true, we think the people in the past were dumber than us. They hadn't made the discoveries we did. There's this sort of natural belief that people in the past, like the cavemen, were dumber than us. But what you have to understand about the cavemen is they were anatomically modern humans. Their brains were essentially identical to ours right now. They had personalities. They had language that we no longer have record of. They had culture. And it's very interesting that humans lived since around 200,000 years ago as hunter-gatherers. The men went out and hunted animals. The women collected berries, fruits, vegetables, things like that for 200,000 years. I want you to imagine that let's say you're one of the very first Homo sapiens somewhere in Africa trying to avoid being cannibalized by Homo erectus. You're eating an orange. I don't know the history of oranges. I don't know if they were there at the time, but a fruit. Let's just say hypothetically something like an orange. And you're eating the orange that you saw growing from the ground. You ripped it out of the ground. You are eating it. There are these tiny little things inside the orange that you really can't eat. Or let's say you don't know you can't eat it and you do eat it. If you don't eat it, you spit it out onto the ground. If you do eat it, you digest it and it survives and essentially goes into your poop. And usually these people had these trash piles, these middens, these heaps, where they put their trash, or where they defecated. Eventually you're going to start noticing these seeds are, because seeds grew by evolution to be spread when their fruits are eaten, to spread the seeds, and even grow through fertilizer. And so eventually you see that oranges, or whatever fruit we're talking about, starts to grow from these seeds. Let's say you live around a lifespan of 30 years. I'm not sure what the lifespan of the average early Homo sapien was. But again, had the same brains we did. Or we do. The same ability to reason and think of cause and effect like we do. They were us. They are us. After a while of living around 30 years, do you not think you would put 2 and 2 together and see that these seeds grow in the ground? And see that these fruits and vegetables have things in them that create more of them? And do you not think, through all our history of shifting climates that make food supplies hard to make, food supply hard to always be hunting and gathering, do you not think that if we stayed as a hunter-gatherer nomadic society for 200,000 years, that we wouldn't have gone extinct at some point if we hadn't put 2 and 2 together, that seeds can grow stuff, and maybe we should store these seeds and create farms with these seeds earlier than the traditional idea that we did not create farming until 10,000 years ago? That's generations and generations and generations and generations upon generations of people that had to have seen agriculture happen, in the sense that had to see seeds grow into stuff and that seeds came from the stuff they ate, and didn't put 2 and 2 together. They didn't see animals that they were nomads and hunted alongside of, and saw that they ate food, and saw that the animals moved with the food from the ground, and that we couldn't take the seeds of what came from the ground and plant it and domesticate these animals. That's a long time where we didn't put that together. Through a bunch of climate shifts where we really needed to have figured that out if we were going to survive. Isn't it a coincidence? Isn't it interesting that we only figure out agriculture 10,000 years ago? Right after a great cataclysm happened that would have wiped out any evidence of anything that happened before it. Isn't that interesting? Well, is there any evidence that we lived as a society, as a civilization, before the Great Cataclysm? Let's go to the Sphinx. And you know, things are about to get crazy when we say, let's go to the Sphinx, let's go to the pyramids. Currently, the traditionally accepted idea of the Sphinx is that it was built for Pharaoh, I forget his name, Pharaoh I don't know his name, starts with a K, has an A in it somewhere, maybe an RF, maybe an E, but a pharaoh who lived in around the 2000s BC. The problem with that is There's no evidence for that. There is no evidence for that. This is what's in textbooks, this is what's in encyclopedias, this is in the traditional scientific establishment, but the problem is, there is no evidence the Sphinx was built in the 2000s BC. There is a sort of a tablet, I think they call it a tell or a tele or something, that's in front of the Sphinx that pretty much suggests that, but also, it was clearly put after the Sphinx was built. The Sphinx was there before the 2000s BC, and one of the pharaohs claimed that it was built for him. The Sphinx was there for a long time. And the weird thing is, there is no documentation, there is no evidence that the Sphinx was built. If it wasn't for the fact that the Sphinx was right there, we wouldn't have evidence for the Sphinx. There would have been no building records. Every time someone says, well, the Sphinx and the pyramids can fall in this category too, by the way. The pyramids have gone through a long process of being worked on. They were built, and then there were different... It's a tomb right now for some of the pharaohs, but it wasn't a tomb to begin with. The rooms with the pharaohs are newer than the pyramids itself, but the Sphinx is much older than that. Well, okay. If there are no record evidence of the Sphinx, can we look at the Sphinx itself and figure out how old it is? Well, we know the head is new. Relatively speaking. The head was probably something more like Anubis. Or maybe something more like a lion. But there is one telltale sign on the Sphinx that tells us that it had to be at least constructed and had been constructed and existing at some point. Well, there is heavy evidence on the Sphinx of erosion, of heavy rainfall. And the only time there would have been that heavy rainfall to create that erosion in the Sahara Desert where the Sphinx is, and where the pyramids are, would have been around 12,000 years ago, with the Great Cataclysm. It seems that the Sphinx was built around the time frame, maybe before, the Great Cataclysm. When would hunter-gatherers have had time to make that? You also have to consider that the pyramids and the Sphinx are in line with Osiris during that time frame, and that they are built in a very exact location. Maybe we'll get into the details on that Giza Plateau later, on a later episode. But all evidence to the contrary point to the fact that the Sphinx is in the ballpark of 12,000 years ago. And the reason we say it's not is because, well, hunter-gatherers couldn't have built that. And then you're like, okay, why are you so sure that hunter-gatherers built that? Why can it have been an agricultural, a society that had already created agriculture? And then the answer is, well, agriculture started 10,000 years ago. We have no evidence of agriculture before then. But the Great Cataclysm would have wiped out evidence of agriculture before then. The Great Cataclysm was destructive. Keep in mind that the sea levels rose quickly with the Great Cataclysm. If you were an ancient society, where do societies tend to build up? They tend to build up on rivers and coastlines. The coastlines were swallowed by the Great Cataclysm. The Giza Plateau happens to be on a river, So it kind of makes sense for it to not be. If there was a society, a civilization before the Great Cataclysm, they would have settled somewhere around the Nile, as well as on the coast of everything that's been sunk. There is an at least 9,000-year-old pillar, monolith, underwater off the coast of Sicily. There is a big, possibly man-made structure off the coast of Yonaguni, sunk under the waters of the Ryukyu island chain. Plato spoke of Atlantis, a city that was technologically advanced, then got full of themselves, and then got sunk underwater. He learned this from his ancestor, I believe his name is Solon or something like that. Solon visited Egypt in 600 BC, and he met the Egyptians, and he was like, wow, this civilization is great and huge, and the Egyptians said, well, it's a legacy of the gods that existed during Zep Tepi. Zep Tepi would be ancient Egyptian for the first time. And Solon was like, Zep Tepi, the first time. And they're like, yeah, and there was Atlantis that got sunk under the sea. And he asked, when was that? And the Egyptians said that the sinking of Atlantis happened 9,000 years ago. 9,000 years ago from 600 BC. Which would be around, 11,800 years ago or something? I can't do math on the fly. That would be exactly when the Great Cataclysm happened. The sinking of I'm not saying Atlantis is real, but I'm saying that might be a legacy. That might be a sort of post-trauma memory of a great cataclysm, of a great flood. And would follow the idea that the coastlines, which we know the sea levels rose, I don't see why it's so hard to imagine that the sea levels rising. We know the sea levels rose, we know people existed, and we know people tend to settle on the coasts. I guess the argument was that the sea levels must have risen slowly. But with the Great Cataclysm, they don't rise that slowly, let's put it like that. But it's interesting that the Atlantis myth is also part of this and is dated to this same general period of time. So we've covered the Sphinx erosion. We've covered that this is the same time period Atlantis was said to have sunk. But we've covered Zep Tepi, we've covered the ice cores. Now, all of this was considered, there probably wasn't a great cataclysm to facilitate this anyway, much less the idea that there was a civilization before the Great Cataclysm. That's only stuff you find in the Bible. Recently, we've made a discovery. I believe the first hints of it were made in the 1970s, but it wasn't until like the early 2000s where excavation really began. Actually, no. Well, when was it discovered? Let me check real quick. And I don't like Googling during podcast recording. When was it discovered? Oh, okay, around 1996. There was an excavation project around 1996 to 2014. They found a small, well, not small, it's relatively big city with an asterisk mark around city because it isn't exactly a city. It's what was originally identified as a city, but as time went on, they realized this isn't just any city. This can't be a city, but it looks like a city. In Turkey, right where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers meet, around that area, they found a discovery called Göbekli Tepe. And it looks like a city. The problem is we can't really find residential areas. It doesn't seem like it was something that was inhabited, necessarily. It looks like something where a bunch of hunter-gatherers gathered and spoke to each other, and it looked like a religious center and maybe a center of learning. But it's a fairly big city with statues. Big statues of people. The problem is, it dates to around 11,000 years ago. And it looks like the general consensus is Göbekli Tepe was where agriculture began, which puts it at around 1,000 years earlier than when we thought it began. And it looks like agriculture was diffused, was disseminated across Mesopotamia. It was originally thought that, agriculture began in Mesopotamia, but it sort of popped up independently in the few city-states there, or what would become city-states. Now we're realizing that Göbekli Tepe, which was founded almost immediately after the Great Cataclysm, all of a sudden had a burst of agriculture, and then it spread downward. And there have been places like, we thought agricultural revolution happened around 10,000 years ago, and that's when cities began. The problem was Jericho. Jericho was an interesting little civilization that popped up around just before 11,000 years ago. It was earlier than the agricultural revolution, and we saw that, this looks like a small city that formed, but this couldn't possibly have happened before the agricultural revolution, and we see that the people of Jericho leave at some point, or die out. So maybe it was an early attempt at civilization, but it couldn't really have been civilization. Göbekli Tepe pops up 11,000 years ago, really towards the end of 12,000 years ago. And it kind of explains where Sumer came from. We traditionally thought of Sumer as the beginning of civilization. Jericho was like a weird prototype of that. But with Göbekli Tepe, we know civilization began, quotes around began, there, with agriculture being started there and disseminated south. But it is right after the Great Cataclysm that happened. So we've pushed agriculture up 1,000, maybe even 2,000 years earlier than we thought. And this place is filled with statues and rock carvings. One rock carving, by the way, depending on how you interpret it, potentially shows a comet impact. But whatever. Statues that are 1,000 years older than the agricultural revolution. We know that stuff like this is only built with agricultural societies, because it's only with agricultural societies where you get the time to... Because now you don't have to hunt and be gathering all day, every day. Now you can let farms build up, and you can do your own thing. This is when we get the division of specialized labor, which allows for artisans, it allows for statues, it allows for walls and structures to be built. Göbekli Tepe is a structure built before we theoretically had the time to build anything. And it looks like it coexisted with hunter-gatherers, that hunter-gatherers went there. The suggestion is Göbekli Tepe is a strong suggestion that that a society that knew about agriculture before the agricultural revolution came out and built up this place to teach the hunter-gatherers agriculture and to teach them different tools. Göbekli Tepe, by many hypotheses, was a center created by people who were survivors of the Great Cataclysm, who lived in a civilization that had agriculture before the Great Cataclysm, the Great Cataclysm wiped away their civilization, and the fragments went off to the hunter-gatherers and taught them agriculture. And with that as... I have a feeling that as time goes on, more and more discoveries will be made at Göbekli Tepe. They had to stop in 2014 because of the Syrian civil war, and the area got a bit too hot. But I think as time goes on with Göbekli Tepe, I think we're going to find more discoveries. We're going to find more discoveries like Göbekli Tepe. Areas, centers of learning for teaching ideas that are older than what we thought they were. The implications you can get from Göbekli Tepe is amazing. The idea that, yeah, we did invent agriculture before 10,000 years ago. And yeah, we had a civilization during the Ice Age. That there was an Ice Age civilization that got wiped out from a flood. This makes Jericho make a lot more sense. Frankly, this makes Sumer make a lot more sense. The fact that there's a rock carving there that could suggest a comet impact is interesting as well. I think this idea that we didn't create agriculture until 10,000 years ago, or even the assumption, some scientists look at Göbekli Tepe and say, oh wow, guess the hunter-gatherers were more advanced than we thought. That they could build stuff before they had time to build stuff. And that doesn't make sense. That doesn't follow what we see of hunter-gatherers that live right now. Think about it. If a great cataclysm happened today, who would survive? The hunter-gatherers who live today, who would just have to make minor adaptations. The civilization that exists now could be wiped out without any sign of it besides maybe like plastics. And maybe what survivors there were of a potential cataclysm would go, if they were to survive, they would have to have fled to the hunter-gatherers. Now, there are some fantastical ideas with this pre-flood society that we might have gone into space, that we might have created planes. I'm not so sure about all of that, but I wouldn't be surprised if there was some sort of almost Roman Empire level civilization that existed before the flood. I would not be surprised. Unfortunately, the very nature of the Great Cataclysm means that any evidence of it would have to be wiped out. But I think the human brain is an impressive thing. I think the human brain would have discovered a lot of stuff before. And the fact that the confirmed moment of... I think there's enough evidence that says the Great Cataclysm happened, okay? And I think that the fact that we only have our evidence of agricultural right after the Great Cataclysm is more of a sign that the human brain could have made agriculture a lot earlier. Keep in mind that there was the idea that humans did not exist in North America until 13,000 years ago. But because we found enough information to suggest that we were here around 25,000 years ago in America, and how much scientific blowback there was from that, even though that doesn't even really contradict the Out of Africa story, because it was against the dogma, it took years before that finally muscled its way through into being accepted as the status quo that humans came in around 25,000 years ago. We're learning interesting things about the Denisovians, or the Denisovans, who are essentially, we're learning that Earth used to be populated not only with Homo Sapiens and Neanderthals, but also by Denisovans. And we're learning that they might have been really smart. They invented the drill thousands of years before Homo Sapiens. They invented the sewing needle thousands of years before the Homo Sapiens, and they spread out pretty far. We're learning more about DNA of skulls in South America. We're learning more about DNA about Polynesians and the people of Easter Island that were laughed at people who supported certain ideas in the 1950s. Then now we're having to admit, yeah, this DNA that we thought was impossible to be in the Polynesians are there in the Polynesians. I don't know if I want to get into some hypotheses right now, but I do think there was a civilization during the Ice Age. Not only was there a civilization during the Ice Age, they might have gone far. They might have mapped out the seas. They might have discovered the Americas. Based on some DNA we have from certain sites in South America, and really based on maps. There are maps from the Middle Ages that are said to have come from lost sources that we no longer have access to today, but originally came from sources way back in the day. And these maps have rivers in the Sahara. A river that didn't exist except in the Ice Age. There's an island by Ireland in a lot of medieval maps that were supposedly sourced from these even more ancient maps that show an island beside Ireland that didn't exist there except for the Ice Age. I would expect more evidence to slowly come out over the years, slowly trickle, unless they really... I'm starting to lose faith in science, to be honest with you, with the scientific establishment, because it's becoming clear that there are political agendas within the scientific community, and if anything comes out that contradicts the current dogma, they're starting to crack down on it more and more. If we were in an intellectually honest age, I would expect more and more things to trickle out, more discoveries to hint that there might have been a civilization before the flood, during the Ice Age, that had their own age of exploration. I wouldn't be surprised if there were people in the Ice Age mapping the globe. And I realize this enters sort of conspiracy theory territory, but I really don't think it's a conspiracy theory. I don't think it's a conspiracy theory any more than the fact that there were humans in North America 25,000 years ago, which science said no, that's not possible. And then they finally buckled down when enough evidence came out and said, yeah, okay, there were people here 25,000 years ago. They must have crossed the land. There must have been another wave that the people who crossed the land bridge 13,000 years ago must have been the second wave. There must have been an earlier wave 25,000 years ago, which, by the way, probably had some sort of Denisovan DNA in them. And it's just incredible. I think we're going to see more of this as time goes on. The craziest hypothesis I have, and by the way, if it stands that, yeah, we were creating agriculture before this, I think we might have gone through several almost extinction events. For example, the Toba eruption. A volcano goes off in around Indonesia, blackens the sky, and is a near apocalypse. That happens around 75,000 years ago. And around, you can debate 50 to 25,000 years ago-ish, there's a new jump. There are caves saying that these people taught us new things. Cave art that these strange people taught us how to create weapons and stuff like that. Perhaps humanity is a cycle of civilization, near apocalypse, people bringing themselves back together, and then another apocalypse. Maybe the people from before the Great Flood are themselves had learned the secrets of civilization maybe around 50,000 years ago from people who survived the eruption of Mount Toba that darkened the skies and would have ended agriculture. Potentially have covered the earth in soot. I used to be more knowledgeable about the Toba eruption. I need to do more research into that to see exactly the impact Toba had, but from what I understand, it was a sort of extinction event. So maybe there is this cycle that we should be aware of, because Earth might not be that habitable of a planet that we build up and then apocalypse, then we have to build up again and then apocalypse, and again, the catastrophic idea that determines human history isn't accepted by the scientific establishment, mostly because it could vindicate some religious mythology to some degree. So what if Toba was another cataclysm? That would make sense. Again, humans have had our same brains for 200,000 years. Something had to have happened. We couldn't have just discovered agriculture 10,000 years ago. Okay, my craziest idea is, if it follows that there is this pattern of collapse and then rebuilding and then collapse and then rebuilding. Did you know that Antarctica didn't always have a sheet of ice? It used to be a perfectly habitable continent around, I think the ice sheet grew around 30,000 years ago, maybe older than that. I think if it turns out that this cycle is true, that people were mapping, that people were mapping the seas, but that we've had this cycle of death and reconstruction, it's perfectly possible that humans might have settled Antarctica once upon a time, maybe around 50,000 years ago. Again, middle-aged maps, one of them shows part of Antarctica in the 1500s, except for the fact that Antarctica wasn't discovered until around 1819. And there are debates over whether or not it's Antarctica on the map, but I think there are a lot of indicators that it is Antarctica. And it does make sense when you think of the island by Ireland and the river by the Sahara, that it could have been charted out by an Ice Age people, an Ice Age civilization. This is the weirdest topic to do for a Historia podcast, man. Now, a lot of people take this theory and think, oh, it was aliens, it was angels, it was the Nephilim. Some people say it was the Aryans, the Hyperborean super white people that made an Earth empire. I don't think it's any of that. I'm not going to make the jump to aliens or reptile people when I think there's enough evidence that it could just be humans. You know? Humans that were technologically advanced, or more technologically advanced than we expect them to be at that time period. And I think the Denisovans might play a role in it, but I don't want to get into that too much. But my theory is that a great flood happened, wiped out an Ice Age era civilization, created a near apocalypse that only the hunter-gatherers really survived. A group of survivors from the Ice Age civilization managed to survive by staying with the hunter-gatherers, and through places like Göbekli Tepe, started to rebuild their society with agriculture that they already had. And from there, it trickled down into the Middle East and spread from there. The Sphinx and the pyramids might have been part of that Ice Age civilization. They're certainly older than the traditional model. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Historia podcast. yeah. I don't know how to close off these things, as evident by the previous podcasts that all seem to end abruptly even though they're edited videos. But, yeah. I don't believe that they were aliens. I don't believe that they were reptile people. I don't believe they were the Aryans, the Hyperboreans that Hitler talks about. But I do think that this sort of explains that there are conspiracy theories about this stuff. It doesn't say the conspiracy theories are true. It might explain why those conspiracy theories exist, though. The Great Cataclysm, the Great Flood. I expect as the years go on, more evidence will come out that supports stuff similar to this. And who knows, maybe I might make a video or a podcast talking about this Ice Age civilization, but we'll see. I picked a really weird topic to be the first proper Historia podcast episode. Thank you all so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned something. I hope your curiosity is piqued. And yeah, have a great day, ladies and gentlemen.